So with that, this week's The World Today will focus on the transnational possibilities of women's human rights organizing and the transformation of society and government through the fight for women's human rights. We are very indebted to the Middle East Center for being a co-sponsor of this event. We are very dedicated to faculty across Penn who have been instrumental in helping us to bring experts to the stage today to talk about women's rights. And I want to not delay things by introducing you to our two guests. So the first one is Hajir El-Sheikh, who is the owner of and CEO of Tomorrow Smiles, a nonprofit that combats gender-based and domestic violence. You can find a longer bio online, so I'm going to keep these pretty short so that we can actually get to the discussion. She's a survivor of domestic violence and an advocate for human rights, gender equity, and issues facing migrants. She was a pro-democracy activist in her home country of Sudan, fleeing the United States to escape political oppression and torture. She's also an author of this book, and maybe we can drop the information in the chat function, but Hajir El-Sheikh, Through Tragedy and Triumph, and you can buy that online, and she'll be able to tell you more about its contents during our discussion. Second, Homa Hutfar is the Emerita Professor of Anthropology at Concordia University. Her expertise is in political economy and legal anthropology with a focus on issues including reproductive rights, Afghan women and youth and refugees in Iran and Pakistan, the hijab and dress codes as political institutions, and gender and citizenship. She describes herself as an academic in the service of civil society and has been actively involved in the research for advocacy and publication division of women living under Muslim laws, feminist networks, and is obviously an author and has many books under her name. Last but not least, and Siri is somewhere online, our third panelist for the day was under the weather and nevertheless labored through being sick in order to appear today online. She is the Associate Director for Global Advocacy at the Center for Reproductive Rights, where she leads the center's work at the United Nations in New York with a focus on sexual and reproductive health and human rights in humanitarian settings. She is an advocacy and strategy expert with 2 decades of experience engaging civil society, governments, and the private sector on public health, human rights, and on the issue of gender and sexuality, including LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS issues. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome our panelists to the stage. And if you uncover your waters, it will help when you get ready to drink it. So, Siri, can you hear all of us? I just want to make sure that technologically you feel included here. For those of you on this stage, we've got a confidence monitor right in front of us. I have a habit of looking over my left shoulder to talk to people, but I'll try to just look in front of me. So, you know, this is an interesting time for women's rights. As you all know, part of the reason we're holding this program is a belated recognition of International Women's Day, which was on March 8th. It always happens during Penn spring break. And I've yet been able to convince senior leadership at Penn to change your spring break so that you're actually here on International Women's Day. So we're celebrating a bit late, but again, appreciate all of you coming out and appreciate that our panelists have flown and driven and appeared from near and far in order to participate in today's discussion. I wanted to give each panelist an opportunity to kind of do a little bit of stage setting for the rest of the discussion, and wanted to begin with a very broad conversation about this really feeling like a transformational moment in women's rights again, at the level of the nation state, more globally, and in systems like the United Nations. So I wanted to hear and begin with a bit from each of you about what the opportunities are right now, and on the other hand, what we should be worried about. And I'd like to begin with Homa.
Well, thank you for the invitation. But actually, I feel quite, I feel torn in one way. I feel quite optimistic, especially with what is happening in Iran. And on the other hand, of course, we have situation in Afghanistan. And also, overall, the right wing and the fascism is growing more strong in the West. So it's kind of worrisome in that way. But also what is interesting for me is that transnational women's movement is coming together in a while, maybe for some time was a little bit sleepy, to use the expression some of us use, but I think by the time Trump was elected to the as a president, and other thing that was happening in Latin America, in the rest of the world, transnational women's movement, they realized if they don't really take care of what they have, the hard work they did since the 70s, they may lose them. In that sense, it is, to me, is a very optimistic moment. And and also the fact that the UN has been quite important with all its shortcomings. It's one important venue for us to come together to discuss. And that, to me, is a very important movement. And I think in the case of Iran, especially, which we had this conversation earlier on, I said, to me, and I was always surprised that the rest of the world were surprised at what was happening in Iran, because we had been expecting it for a while. In fact, to me, it was not a surprise, but it was a bit delayed. So I will be happy to discuss that later on as we go through the discussions. Thank you.
Hajir.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to the Perry World House for organizing this event. It is inspiring to be among—
Hajir, and I'm gonna remind you just
with the
because—
mic. It is inspiring to be among change maker like yourself to shape the future for the generation to come. I'm going to just give a little bit of background. When we say women grooming start from infancy, I have a first-hand experience with that. My experience was when I was 5 years old. At my first experience, I looked up and I saw my mom and my grandma and a third woman holding my legs to perform a barbaric crime, female genital mutilation. At that moment, I didn't know why would they do that as women to other women, and why would you do such a thing? But I was 5 years old. So until I was older, later on, when I realized that female genital mutilation was done to women to show them that they don't have control over their bodies, and to show them that they don't have their end goal. They need to be prepared for their end goal for what the society chooses for them, which is domesticated life and marriage at the end. So I was lucky to be born into a family in Sudan that love, support, and encourage all their children, not just the boys. My father and my sibling were activists, and to grow up in an activist and humanitarian family, I had the knowledge. I got to know that inequality exists, human rights, and especially women rights in Sudan, it was a huge issue. So I began to protest. I started to use my voice, and that started in high school throughout my college. That to the government interpret to them as a threat. For a woman to voice her opinion and to be on the front line, you are a threat to the government. So that I paid high prices with torture, detention, and you name it, with the government in Sudan. Society at large, when they look at women, they or powerful, let's say powerful, strong women, they see them as a threat. That's why we see rape, sexual harassment, and violence against women. They use this against me and women activists in Sudan. And we witnessed that during the 2019 Sudan revolution with the use of weapon as a form of scare tactic to activists. The assault on women's rights has coincided with a broader assault on democracy, not just in Sudan, but here in the US, as Homa mentioned, the Trump era, and I hope it's not coming again. But that's not a coincidence that women's equality is being rolled back. When we have a authoritarianism and we have a dictatorship, then we suffer greatly. And patriarchal authoritarians have a good reason to fear women political participation, because when women participate in mass movement, and we saw in Sudan, they make changes. They succeed, and it will lead to democracy, and that is scare them greatly. Sudanese women were an instrumental figure in the revolution, if you all follow, that led to al-Bashir regime to be taken down. And prior to that, it contributed to Sudan history and to the changes in the Sudan democracy after all. The women were sidelined after the revolution happened in 2019. They were sidelined during the negotiation, not just by the transitional military government, but by the forces of freedom and change, the same people that they will fought with them. The interim government, which is the military and the freedom of forces of change, their constitutional charter stated that women representation must be 40% of the leader of the transitional legislative council member. And the Juba Peace Agreement also state the importance of women representation at all level. But we see that during the interim government, the total participation at that regional time was 11%. And now, following the military takeover in October 25th, 2021, women chances decreased significantly. Violence against women and human rights defender has increased. It threatened their ability to participate in public space. But despite all those challenges, Sudanese women remain remarkably resilient as they continue demanding their full participation in all levels in decision-making. I'm a firm believer that education is the key to most our problem. After all, knowledge is power. And throughout history, we all know that dictators have kept people in the dark. That is especially true to women. We are made to believe that women's right is separate from human right. That was the case up to today. But for example, women's health, domestic violence, rape, the using of rape, like I said, during the Sudanese revolution, and even in our time, it wasn't looked at as human right. And until that happened, we were never going to have a true woman right, as long as we keep separating the two issues. I do believe also empowering women will provide an opportunity to bring their voices to the center of decision-making, and it will transform Sudan and transform everywhere in the world where we see injustice. Then and only then, Sudan and even the rest of the world will undergo the societal changes needed to lead the country or in Sudan or here in the US to true democracy. That is also, like I said, if you remember what Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Siri, and you know, so part of this is kind of a setting of the scene, and then we're obviously going to have a conversation during which you all will be able to ask questions. And part of that conversation will be weaving what's happening in Sudan, in Iran, and in the US and other places, and looking at the UN as a ray of hope, maybe, or a complex space where governments act out their domestic policies and try to advance global policies. And so over to you, Siri.
Thanks so much. And it's so lovely to be here. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person with you. I feel like I've been waiting to meet the three of you in person as we prepared for this panel. So please bear with me. My voice is I'm a little congested, but it's still functional. And, you know, I thought maybe in order to answer the question you've posed, LaShawn, about what the opportunities are and what the concerns are, I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, the center, what our mission is, and what part of the women's rights sort of movement I work in. And so the center, you know, is ostensibly a not-for-profit law firm. Our mission is to ensure that sexual reproductive health and rights are protected in law as fundamental human rights by governments around the world. And, you know, Hajir, that goes to your point. You know, we consider the rights of women and LGBTI people as human rights. They're not separate. And, you know, the way that we come at this is that we tend to be the lawyers, the legal advocates, and the policy makers. So we bring strategic litigation, both in state courts, national courts, before regional and international human rights bodies. And we advocate and provide technical support to governments, which is sort of what my job is. And if you do know of us, you probably most likely know of our work here in the US. We recently litigated a big case here at the Supreme Court the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health case, and that was not, fortunately, a decision in our favor, although I don't think that was because our legal arguments were not up to standard. I think that might be for different reasons. But we don't just work in the States, we work in Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and then of course at the UN. And what do I mean by sexual reproductive health and rights? How does that link to what we're talking about today? And sexual reproductive health and rights are anything from access to life-saving maternal health care, contraception, and of course, access to safe and legal abortion. And we also address sort of gross violations of international law like sexual violence and conflict, child marriage, and forced sterilization. And so I guess, you know, why focus on that as a part of women's rights issues? And for me, the reason that we focus on SRHR, it's what we sort of shorten it to at the UN, is because that really is the cornerstone and precondition for achieving gender equality. So when individuals are denied the ability to make decisions about their own sexual reproductive health, about whether or not they want to have children, their autonomy, dignity, and rights are undermined and denied. And in answer to your question about what are the opportunities and threats right now in terms of sexual reproductive health and rights, I have to say at the UN, which is sort of where I've been focusing my energy on, there's no issue more divisive across the UN membership than access to safe abortion, than access to comprehensive sexuality education, which is basically access for young people around things like how to avoid gender-based violence, how to respond to gender-based violence, how to understand your own body. And it is so disheartening and horrifying that that is the issue that splits the membership. And I think that that is the issue that splits the membership, not because it reflects national policy, as you were saying, LaShawn, but because it's been captured by geopolitics, because it's used as a political football by member states at the UN to sort of score points, you know, from each other across the divide. And what's interesting is that in the last 25 years, we've actually seen almost 60 countries liberalize their abortion laws. And those countries are cross-regional countries. They're not just global North countries. And so the opportunities that we've been seeing in the last 25 years in my area are opportunities that are happening at the local and national level. That's a story of hope. And there's been real change in many national and local contexts. And there's been some reversals in only 4 countries on the issue of safe abortion. This country, the United States, being one of those 4 countries. So those countries are outliers in the national context. But in an international context, there's this very weird, polarized set of discussions that use women's rights somehow to kind of indicate something else. And that something else is a rise in authoritarian and anti-democratic national voices. And I think we can all agree that the bodies of women and LGBTI, and I guess, you know, this also goes to your point, Haji, they're the ones that are controlled by authoritarian governments. They are the canaries in the mine. So when we start seeing legislative regression, which we are at the moment in some areas, particularly in this country, that are sort of, you know, laws that are attempting to control bodies, control women's bodies, control the bodies of queer people, we know that's also an indication of rising authoritarianism. We know it's actually not just about gender, it's not just about women. This is about a set of issues that really link to control, and control from a patriarchal standpoint, from a place of patriarchal control, white supremacy. And I think, you know, there are many opportunities and there are many things to be concerned about in that. The opportunities for me are that the national and local activists, like the ones that are meeting at the UN right now as we speak for the Commission on the Status of Women, there's 11,000 of them that have been in New York. They come with so much resilience. They work intersectionally. They don't silo women's rights issues from issues of the environment, Indigenous rights, issues around race. And they come with innovative strategies, but we're also facing a huge amount of backlash. And that backlash is, you know, really universal in some ways. And, you know, again, it's about this rise of authoritarianism, a rise of control. And I think we can see that not just in sort of the Trump administration and that, and during that era here in the States, but Bolsonaro in Brazil, we saw it in the Philippines. It's just this kind of like, you know, also with Putin, there's like a rise of the strongman, I guess, in government as well. And I think that link to the way that women's rights regress in those countries is a really important one for us to be considering at this moment.
So thank you. And So one of the things that I think I'd like to get at, and it's maybe a reminder and maybe it's not a reminder to our audience here as well as our audience online, is that women's rights work is inherently political. I feel like we've gone through a phase whereby there was an era in the 90s, and many of you were probably too young to remember it, when many people thought that if you could simply prove that not discriminating against women was good for your GDP, that not discriminating against women was like good for your society, that suddenly governments would come running and they would be like, whoa, we never knew this. We're clearly convinced now that we see that we kind of excluded half of our society for a millennium, and we're losing out on GDP and we're losing out on advancement. We'll suddenly be all in support of women's rights. What we've seen since the 90s is that actually, that facts didn't prevail, right? That the facts of proving what the individual harm was to women and the collective harm was to society did not convince people, many people who needed to be convinced, to be more inclusive of women's rights. And so the political nature of women's rights really does mean, as has been pointed out in all of the remarks, a kind of transformation of society at the local level and contesting not just patriarchy, but like unfair and abusive power in government and from government to the family level, let's say. And so part of what I wanted to ask you all collectively is, how has transnational feminism and organizing helped women's rights activism, be it in Iran or other places, in Sudan or other places in the US? Because if there's any long-term and durable solution, it is in part organizing across nations, across religions, across languages. And in some ways, this has been a mantra of the women's rights movement for, 50 years or so. But how does it express itself today? What does it mean in Iran? What has it meant in Sudan? How do you see expressions of that theory at the level of the UN and obviously during the CSW? So maybe we will start with Iran, where there's been news even this week about the poisoning of girls in Iranian schools, which is horrifying and one of many horrifying examples of women's rights violations recently. But Homa, if we could start with you.
Yes, well, I wanted to go back here for your first comments. But I think the knowledge that women can contribute to society if they are more involved didn't change the governments or the men, but changed the women. It changed the women, seeing that in fact they have been controlled and they could contribute more to the life of society and themselves. And so that was an empowering getting. But going back to situation in Iran, especially since 2009, the regime has gone more and more to the right and more insisting on basically controlling women's body. And part of of course, with the uprising, women life freedom, that kind of, and especially seeing that it's not like no longer is the people like my generation or even younger generation, young girls in the schools, in high schools, 17, 16-year-old, they're not buying the kind of ideology that is enforced on them in terms of their gender ideology, and they come and confront the state. So that state then in terms has become much more misogynistic, like in the uprising, even though they shot and killed at the very least 500 people during the uprising. But it was for women, was directed directly at their eyes and their genital. So it was when they were arrested, was sexual abuse and rape and all of that. So it wasn't just torture to get information. It was misogynistic attitude. And then of course they start on attack on the schools, because these teenagers, middle schools, have been also part of the movement, and they have been poisoned at school, and they kept saying it's a rumor, it's nothing. A system, a regime that actually, if 5 girls dance on the roof of the 9th floor of their building, they can come and arrest. They control, like, their surveillance in Iran is rivals China by far, because at least in China, they don't care what you do in your home. In Iran, they care whether you dance or whether you sing or what you do at your home. And now they're punishing the girls in the school. They didn't actually, they said it was nothing for 90 days when more than 340 schools have been attacked. 5,000 girls were really sick, but more than 1,000 have been hospitalized. The regime kept saying is a rumor by Western media, by opposition and all of that. And finally, when they started to arrest, they arrested journalists who have been reporting and investigating this. They arrested their young girls. They said they took the gas in the school because they wanted the school to close for a day. So you can see I mean, of course, to the Iranian, this is quite clear that is the regime that is actually behind this, because the poison gas they use is not something you can buy on the counter, or even you make it without sophisticated equipment. Quite clearly, they have access to at least some faction of the security forces to get this. So you can see this is a very worrisome abuse of the state power over women's and controlling women's body, wanting to push them out of the public sphere. And so we are facing a really misogynistic situation, which is, of course, now with the Taliban on the side, they are learning. They're kind of repeating what Taliban were doing in 2012, gassing the schools. And now we see this in Iran. So the question is, what are we going to do as an international community about this?
And so how do you think that transnational feminism would help, or, would more greatly help the situation right now in Iran?
Well, I think transnational feminism, the solidarity that has been involved, has been quite widespread, and it's like in 2009, I felt there was a sympathy. Now we have the solidarity. It's very important. It's very important that we keep talking about it to be important. But what I was disappointed, for instance, especially in case of Afghanistan, is that we didn't see a global march by women's movement across the world. This is what we had hoped. This is what Afghan women had hoped. Okay, we have seen, we have talking, but talking to the government is not the same as having the solidarity at the global level. The fact that the situation in Afghanistan is not going to stay there. As we see, it now has moved to Iran in this way. It's going to move to the region, and from there to the wider society will come and haunt us everywhere. As the training of the extremists, I'm calling them freedom fighter, then created 9/11 for the West. It took a while, but it did come to the West. I think we have to be very vigilant about these issues, and make more use of all the solidarity and care we feel, but we have to also organize. Organization is very important aspect of bringing change.
I'm going to move to Siri and then to Hajir. And before that, I'm going to make one observation, which is that, again, I feel like there are some evergreens in doing women's rights work. But one of them is that we get boxed into this kind of system whereby in lots of countries, the very notion of women's rights, and God forbid to use the word feminism, is used to show that you're betraying your own culture, is used to show that you've somehow been infiltrated by the West. And so that when we talk about solidarity, that we have to be in some ways mindful of the fact that there's some communities who might not want it because they then get identified as being instruments and puppets of the West. And so how it's done has to obviously be in very close consultation with the groups with whom we're in solidarity. But there's a dance there, and there's a fine balance between kind of who leads, what's being said, what the priorities are, so that it's informed solidarity, and so that that solidarity isn't used against kind of the very issue and themes that the solidarity movements are working to advance. So first to Siri, then to Hajir.
Thanks so much. And I think, it's so interesting as you were reflecting on the measurement of success being a positive impact on GDP. And I think, there are so many problems with trying.
Not my analysis.
No, absolutely. But I think it's really led to so many issues, because if we then sort of the premise of that argument, was that capitalism would sort of solve a lot of gender equality issues, and full inclusion of women and other people will be beneficial economically. And there are actually a lot of economic benefits to violations of human rights. And so when we start to try and roll out like this argument of economic benefit for inclusion, for respecting rights, what we see is that we actually don't have a lot of evidence to stand on. Sometimes it is beneficial to respect the rights of people. In the HIV response, it is very beneficial to ensure that, men who have sex with men and sex workers are not criminalized, because it helps the public health response. But there are many examples where equality and human rights really aren't sort of an economically valuable thing in a capitalist system. And we have a lot of really big problems right now. We have a climate crisis, we have growing conflict, we have protracted humanitarian settings that are proliferating. We're at the tail end of a global pandemic, and there's growing inequality. And so in some ways, as I'm reflecting on kind of the benefits of transnational feminist movements, it's to solve some of those problems. And those problems are direct consequences of patriarchy, neocolonialism, and white supremacy. And we're not going to think our way out of it in the same way we thought our way into it. And so in some ways, the argument now is that transnational feminist movements, which are inclusive of women's movements, but also include Indigenous movements and LGBTI movements and other movements, they're intersectional in nature. They are going to be able to offer us solutions to some of the biggest problems that we're facing right now. And those problems can't be measured economically. They're measured by the soul of humanity. They're measured by the longevity of our planet. And so just to talk a little bit about what that looks like in the UN space, I think right now what we have is many advocates in New York. I actually think I'm sick because I've spent a lot of time in amongst thousands of advocates in the last week, which is just, such a highlight of my job, not getting sick, but spending this time. And I can't say that I hold hope in the UN system per se. In fact, I don't think the UN system was ever set up to promote women's rights. It was, there were a couple of women involved in the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights, but they were the exception. And the reason that international human rights law has been interpreted to include women, to include LGBTI people, is because of activism. It's because of legal activism and advocates and Indigenous activists. Women, LGBTI people have interpreted international law to include us. And the system did not start off that way. And so I have a lot of hope about using the UN system to further our intersectional agendas, but I don't think it's the system that's actually going to deliver those solutions. I think it's the way the system offers a convening space for activists to come together. The sort of overarching theme of the Commission on the Status of Women this year is about technology and the way technology intersects with gender equality. And I've sat there amongst activists in the last week hearing the most incredible responses to the way in which they organize at the local and national level and hold their governments to account. That's why they're coming to New York, to hold their governments to account on the international stage. It's a soft version of accountability, but it matters because states don't like to be looking bad in front of other states. They all sort of want to look like they've got these great records on, sort of a whole range of issues. And they love to point fingers if their activists are in town, sort of making others look bad. So, the system itself is definitely not the saving grace. In fact, the system is really, it's a difficult one to measure success in. The UN was set up really, I think you can measure the success of a UN by the absence of an adverse event. It's set up to avoid war, and it's not set up equally. The winners of the Second World War have way more power than the rest of the countries. It's kind of, full of all of those neo-colonial power dynamics. But the people who come to sit in those spaces and try and speak truth to power, to interpret international human rights law at the local level, they make a difference. And those spaces are facilitated by technology, but they're also facilitated by in-person convenings. And so for me, transnational feminist movements, they're so important in sharing knowledge, in sharing strategies, in sharing information and insight onto what the opposition is doing. And by the opposition, I mean those who really want to see the bodies of women controlled. And it's also, I guess, to that point that Homer speaks about, it goes beyond just showing sympathy to, you know, others in desperate situations. It's really about strategizing together and building coalitions that are able to utilize and harness opportunities in the international stage together. And it makes me think about, there's a quote by Leela Watson, a really famous Australian Indigenous activist, and she said in response to being asked how, you know, the Indigenous movement could be helped by a white woman, is to say that, like, you know, if you've come here to save me, you're wasting your time. But if our liberation is genuinely bound together, then let us walk together. And I think that is the power of transnational feminist movements, is that you walk together and you share stories and you share resilience and you share strategies.
Hajir, we'd like to hear from you. And then I have an immediate follow-up question. And then I'm saying to those of you online and those of you in the audience, there is a microphone to my right, and get your questions ready. Hajir.
I'm going to start by what Siri said about the UN. Being an activist for over 30 some years, and we met with UN every time. And I agree, they're not there. The system is not there to make a change or help. It's just there. It exists. And especially with the situation, we had a meeting last week with the situation in Sudan. Like in Sudan, the ongoing brutal violence, not just against the women, it's women, children. There is over 121 young protesters that were killed using direct weapon. Like Homa said, it's being delivered to them from neighboring country. UN, UAE, Saudi, US is watching, but Egypt and China and Russia. While we are all as an international society watching, those countries meddle in Sudan politics. That's not an accident or an incident, but ongoing violence, it did not stop. With the coup, it affected so many women that were raped, over 7,000. And those numbers are not accurate because you don't have like accurate measure, but over 7,000 were injured, and not just injured, direct injury, like what happened in Iran, direct hit to the eye, to the genitals, to the heart. You shoot to kill, you aim tear gas to kill, you use any kind of weapon that you have as a government. And like she said, also in Iran, it happened in Sudan, and you can see the same thing happening in that region. Those weapons are not something that you can make at home. Those things that governments provide to other government. So the authoritarian, the dictatorship, so that cycle could continue. But the violence and the atrocity, we have cases of enforced disappearance. We have cases of rape, and that's starting from the genocide in Darfur. And that also shows us that when we turn the blind eye to an issue that happened in one region, it's going to happen somewhere. It might not happen in the US today or tomorrow, but it bound to be happen at some point. The military coup that happened in Sudan, it happened in different part of the whole entire world, but the country, the regime currently control over 80% of the Sudan government, Sudan resources. And that is under our all, like the UN and every other country's eyes. Nothing was done. We didn't stop them. But to answer your question, LaShawn, is in Sudan, the Sudanese revolutionists learned that their feminist movement, and it's not just about body, but it's about the simple human right. I mean, here we're advanced the hierarchy of needs. You know, once you meet something, then you go to the next. In Sudan, we're still at that first safety and finding shelter or food or all of that, just to be able to walk on the street without getting killed or raped or sexually assaulted, all those issues that women face. But they learn that their movement are powerful, or a powerful weapon, that authoritarianism and dictatorship like the Sudan current government, they can't afford to ignore it. So one thing they do is they're gonna silence it by what? By everything that I said earlier. Detention, all of that. While the progress has been made in Sudan, women's rights in Sudan is still lag behind any other country, especially under the increasing militarization currently of the state and the restriction of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. So most women find themselves bound to stay home and not voice their opinion. Women's rights in Sudan indicate that the country has long way to go in achieving equal right for women, for children, for men, for everyone. So that also take us back to women's right, our human right. You cannot discuss one without discussing the other. But as protests continue and women persist in fighting for their right, Sudanese people can finally see, like they keep fighting. This is 2019 and they're still out on the street. They're not tired, they're fighting. Women make 70% of protesters in Sudan. But yet, when it comes to decision-making, they're 11% that I said earlier. We learned a lot. We learned a lot from the revolution.
I'm going to ask a final question. So I expect to see people walking over to the mic as I pose this question, to which I would like brief answers. So, and it's a little bit of my own personal hobby horse, but since I'm moderating, I get to feature it. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who many of you know as one of the people who originated critical race theory in the United States, and who's an academic and who has a campaign in the US called Say Her Name that is about remembering the names of people who've experienced, and women, particularly women of color, who've experienced violence in the US. So I say the name Mahsa Amini because we've not said that name, right, during this entire convening. So we say her name. And I want to transition to like a space of what may seem like a very basic question to you, but I assure you it is absolutely central to the advancement of women's rights and to securing them, which is why does the issue of women in public space matter? How they present, how they dress, what they say, and how women in public space outside of the home participating in public life is a threat everywhere. And I pose that question generally to you all. It's a big question, actually. It's got many layers to it because it is the root of many revolutions that governments and others push women out of public space and penalize and punish them for being in public spaces in ways that others consider to be unacceptable. So why does it matter that women have total freedom in all aspects of their lives, including to be in public as they see fit? I pose that question to you all. You got to answer it quickly because I'm going to be turning to the mic any minute now. Who'd like to go first? Homa.
Go ahead, Homa.
Well, at least in Iran, we have experiences from day one when this regime came, what to wear, whatever previous regime to what not to wear. The state sees as their job to say to women what to wear and not to wear. And this is not new. I may remind some of you who know the history, the French Revolution, when it happened, in the very first few years, they had the whole raft of laws, what women can wear, what they can't wear. They can't wear anything that parts. In fact, the last law that prevented women to wear pants was struck out of the books in the February of 2013. Until then, women couldn't, and then the law was and later amended to say you can sit on the, if you're on the horse, you can wear a skirt that breaks in the middle. So I want to say that in fact, control of what we wear is very important to the state and control of society. So I never talk about the hijab and all this just as hijab, but as a political institution. And all state, whether it's our state in the West or other states, are always use that political institution to control us, to pitch us against one another, to all of these things are very important. So it's not a simple matter. It's our choice. It should be our choice. And we don't want anyone to tell us what to wear and not to wear, because it leads to control us in a very fundamental way, in this very simple way. Thank you.
In Sudan, there is a law, it's called the Public Order Law. That law allow any man, and when I say any man walking on the street, to see a woman and direct and say, you are not dressed appropriately to his standard. That, the result of that is lashing, flogging, and detention. We all suffer from it. I was detained. I was thrown in jail for a whole day in college because I wasn't wearing a scarf. That law is made to degrade women, and the whole point is a control. So this theme is control. It's not about what you dressed. It's about to control the mind, to control, it's a whole full complete control. So that public law and order in Sudan was removed, and women were protesting, were going out, talking about their rights, and this is not acceptable. It was reinstated again after the coup. The revolution took us 10 steps forward, and then the military coup from the same people that cause human crime against humanity. Do you know that the second, I'm sure you guys know that the second chair in Sudan is Hamidti. Hamidti is the Janjaweed leader who caused the Darfur genocide, who burned villages, raped women. They caused atrocity and caused unbelievable crimes in Sudan, and their names are given, like they're well known. He's the second chair, and General Al-Burhan. Both of them serve under al-Bashir, and they reinstated the public law. So the question here is not if women can dress the way they want it. The question is, why are we doing this? Why are we controlling? It's not for clothes, definitely.
Siri, we'll turn to you, and then we'll turn to our first question in our audience here on Locust Walk. Siri.
Yeah, I mean, such a great question. It's about power. You know, power sits in the public space and in the public world, in our world, and that's the way it's constructed. The most unsafe place for women, girls, adolescents, and LGBTI people to be is at home, in the family. That is where they're most likely to be, you know, victims or survivors of violence of any sort. So keeping them in that private sphere is a power play. And just to quickly add on to this issue of controlling what people wear, I do want to cast our sort of view back to the United States. Tennessee, Florida, Oklahoma have all passed bills or are in the process of trying to pass bills that control who can wear dresses, who can wear pants. I don't think it's that different from the states that we've just been talking about. The anti-drag bills are about controlling the bodies of LGBT people, what they can wear, who can express femininity and who can express masculinity, and it comes from the same place. France has a law which banned the women from wearing a hijab, as did my other own home country, Denmark. And so I think it can play out when you sort of, I think sometimes Western countries get away with sort of being very progressive and democratic, but they are also about control, and they can try and control women's bodies and the bodies of LGBTI folk in legislative regression in similar ways, but playing out on the opposite side of the issue. So that would be my 2 cents worth on that.
And as we move to our first question in the audience, not dissimilar from still what happens in this country, though it's talked about less, which is that women who experience sexual violence in different circumstances, including young women who go to college, are often still grilled on what they were wearing, whether they invited the assault, was it appropriate for their circumstance, et cetera. So the point is that there are gradations of this all around the world, including in the United States.
Hi, thank you guys so much for sharing. Oh, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm a first year in the husband program, and I'm just really proud to be here today. I have had the privilege to do a little bit of research on the idea of feminism and whether that's truly universally applicable, especially in India. And I know Indian activists have often struggled to mobilize Hindu women specifically to protest gender injustices and to directly fight them. And that's kind of an avenue of culture and religious practices therein. So my question to you is, we've talked a bit on that idea of governments framing women who are mobilized in femininity as puppets of like the Western regime and Western influence. So how do we create feminists in these, you know, non-Western countries who are in touch with the lived experiences of women therein and can take unique approaches to be able to mobilize women so that it's not seen as like a morally opposed idea?
Who would like to take that on?
I will take a
Ajia?
quick stab. Yeah, international support. Earlier, Homa said solidarity. I think, like women in Sudan, if I can speak up on behalf of women of Sudan, they don't want people to intervene because you don't want to be someone's voice. You want to amplify their voices. So we don't want to tell the Sudanese women or women in India or anywhere that they need to do this, but we can support them. Solidarity goes a long way. We don't go out and march in here. I do, but you know, people normally don't go and march when they hear injustice in somewhere. So what we can do is we can write to the UN, go rally, visit when their government presidents are here, go to embassies. If you hear there is an issue going on in one country, share your thoughts, your voice, support them. That will go a long way. It will work more than you trying to tell them how to run their life, basically.
And in the interest of, because as usual, we have a lot of questions at the very end. So I'm going to ask for our next live question. Then I'm going to move to 2 questions online that I'm probably going to ask you all individually. I'm going to ask someone to answer these questions, but let's start with the question here in the audience.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for the wonderful.
Want to introduce yourself? I know you.
Sure. My name is Christiana Kalan Kelly, and I'm a 6th-year PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. I was really compelled by your examples of young women in schools engaging, but then you also opened with a really powerful story of your grandmother and your mother, really kind of being a source of tension and conflict between understanding your rights as a woman. So I was wondering if all of you or a few of you could kind of share some more concrete example of intergenerational solidarities and the works that you do, and also the platforms you give young women to advocate for their rights. Thank you.
And very briefly, intergenerational solidarity and knowledge transfer and platforms.
Well, if I may just go, I think if you see at least some of the demonstration that happened in Iran, you see young people, you see middle-aged people, and earlier on, like I remember one of the fantastic memory I have is in 2006 when there was a demonstration in front of University of Tehran. There were daughters, mothers, and grandmothers talking there and having the same slogan. And so those are important. I think it's happening. Intergeneration solidarity is an important aspect in feminist movement, and we all trying to actually promote it, because what happened in the past, we had one wave of feminism. They would have a goal, achieve it, and they go home, and then things get worse. Then the next generation comes. This generation, we are trying to pass the torch to others to continue, because we learned if we are not there in the street, if we are not defending what we gain, we lose it sooner or later.
Hajir?
My sister is right here sitting. I came from a long family of activists, and I am 46 years old. I've been an activist since I was 12. I was the spokesperson for the Democratic Party. Women there are very resilient and strong. And you will see what Homa said. You will see a daughter, a mother, and a grandmother, and you educate people around you. I can go on for the whole night with the stories that happened to me personally, and it would just show you that women sometimes are made to believe that they're superior, and from generation, like what happened, my time was better than my mommy's time. My mommy's time was better than my grandmother's time in Sudan, but they were all practicing, for example, female genital mutilation, child marriage. Women in Sudan, you can find 10 years old, 12 years old getting married in certain part. So education. But there are so many stories that you can hear. It shows you resilience and continuation of the fight.
Siri, and then I'll move to 2 online questions.
Yeah, I think the question is about encouraging intergenerational dialogue. And I think, that's always been part of my activism as well. I am 42 and have been part of LGBT and feminist movements since the late 90s. And I think for me, spaces of convening that support intergenerational dialogue have been just paramount in my own learning. And then now, as someone that's sitting in between generations coming up and generations that have come before me, they're also integral. So it's about creating that space where you can sit and strategize, and also, you know, I guess not just think about it as what you can learn, but also sort of think about this reciprocal communication, or like what elders can teach young people. It's what young people can also teach, you know, the elders. I'm now part of the elders, which is kind of horrifying, but also very exciting. You know, I feel like it's those moments of creating intentional space that lead to the intergenerational dialogue that we're talking about, that needs to be woven into the infrastructure of your institutions. Needs to be woven into convenings at the national, international, and, you know, sort of local levels. Needs to be supported by donors who really consider the way in which they can help create some of those spaces through the distribution of resources. And so, you know, I just don't think there is a feminist movement without intergenerational dialogue. It doesn't exist. There's no sort of, no one owns the sort of feminist movement in terms of a generation. So it's a multi-generational movement by its very nature. And I think, you know, part of that is about ensuring that we keep and maintain our eye on access to education, access to accurate information, which is what younger generations need, but they don't need us, you know, to sort of like open the door. They just need access to knowledge and analytical thought process, and then they'll always sort of go far beyond where we got to as well, I think.
I have an online question that I'm going to ask very briefly. So the question specific to the US, and to the person online who asked the question, I'm going to make it kind of general so that we can get an answer that maybe is not US specific. And that question really is about how does one make progress on women's rights not be a zero-sum game endeavor, right? That progress on women's rights might mean that we either ignore or fail to fully understand instances where men might be doing worse for whatever series of reasons. You know, in this country in particular, lately at least, kind of higher suicide rates, more unemployment, lower high school graduation rates compared to their female counterparts, et cetera. But the broader question is, how do you make movements for gender equality inclusive and not a part of a kind of zero-sum game analysis? And sadly, I need a kind of brief answer, and I will ask Homa to answer that.
Well, I actually think that's a very important question to show that when women actually have more rights, men tend to have, at least in our experience, have a better time. But part of the problem is we haven't involved maybe enough men in the movement, and to get, especially starting from younger age, getting people in the movement, then you can see that this zero-sum idea that some people have put forward doesn't work. A good example is in Iran. Women Lives Freedom Movement is started by young women and around young women, but young men were in the street in huge number, and in defense, defending the women, especially from the violence of the government. So it is actually, I think that is changing, but we need to be much more conscious to include younger men, especially, but also to show that the right we gain is not what they lose. That's what feminism has been a bit slow in dealing with, and I think we have passed that stage, but we need to work on it a little bit more.
So gain for women is actually a gain for all. And last, and Siri, maybe I'm going to put you on a spot a bit, but this question is directed at you specifically, and I'm going to try to summarize it, which is that for those of you who may know it, there was an incident recently where some American citizens traveled into Mexico and were a part of a kind of gunfight, abduction, and murder. So this question is about cross-border and international strategizing on the femicidios, right? Violence against women that's been happening in Mexico at a staggering level for generations. So what type of international solidarity and cross-border movement building has there been in relation to that? and not just because of the latest US kidnappings, which highlighted just the level of generalized violence in Mexico. Siri, and then I should close out.
Oof, that's a tricky one. I mean, I think what I would say is that what we work towards is ensuring that international human rights law, which many countries have signed up through international treaties and covenants, has an eye on the way in which violence disproportionately impacts women, girls, adolescents, and LGBTI people. And so what we want to see is that governments have infrastructure in line with international human rights law, which has been interpreted really through a lot of amazing women. I would say that I'd be a bit cautious about just responding to a kidnapping case. You know, violence against women and girls and adolescents, as I've said, it's much more likely actually to occur in the home by someone they know. So this like concept of a dangerous outside world for women, for girls, for adolescents, isn't that it's not true, but when we really unpack violence, what's so complicated about it when it's gendered is that it's happening in the private sphere, and it's happening at the hands of people who actually know and are meant to be part of a protective infrastructure for these people. So I would say that if you're interested in a transnational approach, then really start to think about what the feminist movement is saying about that, which is that we want to interpret national law to ensure that the private sphere is also regulated in terms of keeping bodies safe. You know, because at the end of the day, it's not about men or women, it's about patriarchy, and patriarchy damages everybody, men, women, and gender non-conforming folk as well. And that is the real issue. It's not necessarily men versus women or, you know, countries versus citizens. It's about this issue of patriarchy.
And on that note, I want to just have two sentences to close us out, then to thank our guests, then to invite you all to grab and go lunch and or snack and to tell you about what's going to happen next. But this is something I look forward to every year. And I think that if you've learned things in spending an hour with us, it is that you've got to unlayer the onion. And that there is kind of what appears to be, and then there are all of the knock-on effects of what it means to be controlling bodies in public spaces, what it is to have legislation on the book that penalizes people for things like sexual expression or gender identity, what it means to protect the home, which is often a site of violence for a lot of people, and what it means to try to contain and control women's decision-making in all their lives, that we not end up with this system of a hierarchy of where it's acceptable for women to have rights and to express themselves and to express decision-making, and where it's kind of off limits. So some things are acceptable and some things are not. The underlying problem with that argument is that it takes autonomy and decision-making away from women. And I think we need to be able to kind of in a more sophisticated way understand power imbalances. And when we have regulations, either in law and in practices of people's bodies and decision makings, in whose service is that? And what power structures are being further enabled or further deepened through that control? And that we, again, do more than accept it at face value, that we unpeel things and we understand how they're connected to one another across regions, across language, across religions, across sexualities, et cetera. So I hope that you have gotten some takeaways from this. And I want to now turn to thank our guests for a really, really wonderful and rich discussion. So round of applause. And I also then want to take a moment to let you all know about a couple of events that are coming up. So bear with me, that I think are extremely important. So one is the Center for Africana Studies will host the president of Botswana here on the 20th at 5:30, and you can go to their website, again, the Center for Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania, to sign up for that. And ideally, it might be dropped in the chat function for those of you who are online. Next week at Perry World House on the 22nd of March, we're going to have two public convenings that are part of our annual global colloquium for our global shifts theme. It's going to focus on extreme heat. And on the first day, we're going to be featuring 5 extreme heat officers, all women from around the world, talking about how to live, survive, and thrive in extreme heat, and what, in fact, different governments are doing to deal with this climate change catastrophe. Similarly, later on that afternoon, we're going to be featuring the author Jeff Goodell in conversation about a forthcoming book he has on extreme heat and how to survive it. And I hope that you will go online to Perry World House to sign up for all of these public convenings. As you know, you can also participate via Zoom and spread the word. You all know, but I have to say it because if not, people at Perry World House will be mad at me. We have a YouTube channel. This program and others will be in that YouTube channel in a couple of days. You can follow us on our website, our mailing list, and other social media. And with that, thank you. And there's a grab and go snack in the back. Thank you.